My name is Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. And before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on social media, on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as our YouTube channel. Today, we're very excited to welcome Damon Galgut in conversation with James Wood, winner of the 2021 Booker Prize. Damon Galgut's The Promise is an epic drama that unfurls against the unrelenting march of national history, a modern family saga written in gorgeous prose. Haunted by an unmet promise, the Swart family loses touch after the death of their matriarch. Adrift, the lives of the three siblings move separately through the uncharted waters of South Africa. Anton, the golden boy who bitterly resents his life's unfulfilled potential. Astrid, whose beauty is her power. And the youngest, Amor, whose life is shaped by a nebulous feeling of guilt. Reunited by 4 funerals over 3 decades, the dwindling family reflects the atmosphere of its country, one of resentment, renewal, and ultimately hope. Galgut is the author of several books and plays. 2 of his novels, The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room, were both shortlisted for the Booker Prize in previous years. Damon joins us from Cape Town, South Africa. Damon will be joined in conversation by James Wood, staff writer at The New Yorker. Since his first essay collection, The Broken Estate, in 1999, he has been regarded as one of the leading literary critics in the world. His newer books include How Fiction Works and Serious Noticing, selected essays 1997 to 2019. He's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. This evening's event includes an audience Q&A. Please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question at any time. And if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, you can upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Most importantly, please support Damon and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us. A link to buy The Promise, as well as a link to buy James's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Damon, James, we're thrilled to have you both with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Damon, it's a treat to see you. It seems all too appropriate that that you are bathed in a sort of warm southern light, seemingly, and I seem to be sort of scarified by kind of Arctic, polar New England light. But there we are. We speak across great distances, but these are narrowed by literature. As you know, I was and am a great admirer of your latest novel, The Promise, which recently won the Booker Prize. And I thought that perhaps the best place the thing that interests me most as a first question is one of its marks of distinction, it being the style in which it's written. It has a kind of what seems to me a sort of modernist narrator, which allows you to move between different characters, often inhabiting a character's voice, but also, when you want to, moving slightly away from that character's voice, sort of hovering inside and outside at the same time. And when I wrote about the book in The New Yorker, I naturally gestured towards modernist predecessors like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf. I'm particularly thinking, say, of the middle of To the Lighthouse, where Virginia Woolf describes 10 years in the life of a house when no one is there. But there may be there may well have been other models for you, and I just wanted really to ask you first of all about this style. At what point in the writing of the book did you realize, that's what I need to get this 4-piece, this 4-part book of funerals going? So at what point did that seem essential? And and where, as it were you looking, if at all, in literature for examples of that being successfully manipulated?
One thing the Booker does, of course, is set up multiple platforms for conversation. So I'm keen to answer you with as much freshness and sincerity as I can. I have spoken in quite a few interviews about the discovery of the voice, which came about through the writing of a film script, or a couple of drafts of a film script that were offered to me. But I think it's true to say that I'd made a start on the novel and was maybe about 20,000 words into it when I had this diversion into film. And it was only when I returned from the writing of the film script to the book that I suddenly saw that I could import, as it were, the logic of a camera to the viewpoint of the narration in the book. Up till then, I'd been working in quite a stolid, earthbound and traditional sort of way, which is to say, using a narrator whom I was going to great lengths to try to make invisible and to conceal, to give what seemed to me the required impression that the narrator is not there. You're looking through a pane of glass at the sequence of events. But I was extremely frustrated with it. So I guess my frustration, without necessarily being articulated to myself as such, came around the fact that I feel innately constrained by whatever voice I adopt. I mean, I'm sure lots of writers feel that. I mean, in the most obvious sense, if you're writing in a first-person narration, you cannot move outside the skull of that particular person. But even, of course, an omniscient third-person narrator has its limits. Anyway, what I discovered with the cinematic logic that I brought to the book was that inside a scene, I could cut from one point of view to another. That I could, pull right back and give a more detached, cold view of a happening or a conversation, or else move in and focus in a much more granular way on a particular detail, and still sort of maintain a kind of a forward momentum. Now, I'd like to answer you and say that the origins of this kind of thinking lay in very particular modernist writers. And in a sense, that's true, because my writing sensibility was formed, I think, as it is for most of us, in my much earlier years, when I was reading voraciously. And the writers that excited me the most were, modernist writers, who seemed to me, I mean, I may be wrong, and I would happily be corrected by you, but it seems to me that modernism was perhaps the period when the novel was at its height, certainly at its boldest and most experimental, with the most self-conscious sense of its own power.
Yes.
I mean, those possibilities seem to have dwindled a great deal as the novel has moved, from the center of cultural life much more to the margins, I think. But I had not read Virginia Woolf at that time, and the first time I encountered her was actually during the writing of this book. But The Spirit of Faulkner certainly hangs very heavy over it, and one of the books that excited me most in my early years was As I Lay Dying, with what he's doing with voice. But when I did encounter Virginia Woolf, she indeed does play with voice in much the same way, but what she does with time is very much more sort of enthralling or central to her project, it seems to me. So yes, I think in different ways, those writers and others gave me a kind of permission to be bold and to push into all kinds of nooks and crannies that a more traditional approach would certainly not allow. But in fact, the impulse, the origin was not in literature, it was in film. I mean, I do love film, while again, in a different sort of way, being frustrated with its limits, but that's another conversation, I guess.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a very roundabout answer, but I think
that was terrific and very interesting because actually, for so often when people think about the logic of the camera or the logic of cinema in fiction, in realist terms, they don't think about it as you do. They tend to think about it as you were thinking about it when you started writing your novel. That's to say, an impersonal and invisible authorial presence who doesn't have a lot of freedom, but is simply there to watch things. Whereas you've taken that realist logic, if that's what it is, and then through the transformations of voice on the page, it's not exactly realist anymore. I was completely fascinated by it. I just want to give an example because not everyone here will have read the book. I hope most have, but for instance, there's a bit where you describe Anton growing up, Anton as a baby, and the black housemaid, housekeeper, Salome, and you write, she has seen him grow up from a tottering infant to a golden boy to this, whatever he is now. When he was little, he used to call her mama and tried to suck on her nipple, a common South African confusion. That what then you're able to do, that last little bit it was tremendously exciting for me to read it, because suddenly it brought back something I love in literature, and that I feel, precisely as you were suggesting, is not present enough in contemporary literature, and that's the power of irony. This sort of double consciousness that the narrator allows you to sort of, I mean, in the passage I just read, the narrator is sort of possibly in Salome's consciousness for a minute as she's looking at Anton, maybe, and then moves away from Anton into this dryly ironic, try to suck on her nipple, a common South African confusion, which doesn't really belong to anyone in the text. And that's where real energies and ironic force can be used. The only other contemporary writer that I could think of who really likes doing this kind of thing is the Portuguese novelist Saramago, who will often sort of break away into kind of proverbial, almost like a sort of Greek chorusy kind of thing in which proverbs are used ironically to qualify what's going on in the text. But I loved it because if you think of the sort of historical richness and complexity that you're dealing with here, then an ironic voice is absolutely what's needed.
Once you begin to make these abrupt jumps in points of view, you immediately draw attention to the fact that this is an artificial construction. You abandon the pretense that you are a clear pane of glass and become a camera, as it were.
Yeah.
So what I did was, instead of trying to minimize the role of the narrator, I went in the other direction and thought, let me build on the fact that there very clearly is a presence of some sort narrating this moment and the one that follows, and so on. In other words, all stories are told by somebody, so let us amplify the sense that this is a story being told to you. Part of the artificiality, it seems to me, of storytelling is not only in the stability of or the perceived stability of narration, it's also in the perceived stability of the narrative tone. So different stories, if you like, can be narrated with slightly different voices, different inflection, different tones. So I allowed the voice to slide, as it were, between different, not only different perspectives, but between different tones at the same time, which you know, in an instinctual way, I guess, correspond with the perspective of the moment. So to make that less abstract, there are times when the narration pulls right back out of almost out of the human element of the scene, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
Which one of my editors said to me felt like a kind of cruelty. And I think the tone does become cold at very particular moments when the point of view is quite distant. But then, you know, I like to think I make up for that by moments when the narration actually pulls in so close to a character that it falls, as it were, into that character's head. You've referred to the technique, I think, as close third person. But which is the opposite of cold. I think it becomes so warm that in fact it lapses this particular narrative into the first person at particular moments. You're so close to a character that you're actually speaking in their voice at a particular time. And you're right, it opens a kind of a choral effect. And I'm very glad you mentioned Saramago in your review, and again now because he very much was an influence. I mean, I love Saramago's writing and that sort of choral music, as it were, that he builds up. Although I think I consciously made it a little bit more discordant than he does, because the South African chorus is quite a discordant one, and I wanted to get some of that jangle.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean about that moving from an almost cold externality into the interior. I mean, an example that a scene I'm thinking of, a particularly wonderful one, is when you're describing the house at night and people are asleep, and you know, thin walls separate consciousnesses. Someone is asleep, you know, Astrid is asleep in one bed, someone else is asleep next door, and you can just essentially move between their dreams, between their sleeping or their waking, and that feels very intimate, actually, for all that a camera, as it were, is silently, stealthily moving between rooms, which might suggest something not intimate. But it's just one of those wonderful alchemies of voice. And in recent months, I've just found when people, students or otherwise, have been asking me, "Oh, I'm really interested in free and direct style, and give me a contemporary example." I've said to most of them, The Promise. Go and look at The Promise, because you'll see a fluid movement between third and first person, between outside and inside, between external commentary and intimate inhabiting of a character. Yeah, you mentioned the external thing. The book ends, let's remind listeners, viewers, the book pretty much ends with a quite alarming voice saying, "Other stories will write themselves over yours, scratching out every word, even these." That's about as external as you could get. You mentioned the South African context, Damon, and I wanted to, of course, ask you about that. The farmhouse novel, the family novel. In my review, I mentioned the obvious precursors, perhaps, and by the way, it's an annoying critical habit to mention precursors. It delights me that your instinct is to say, actually, there are fewer precursors than you think. That's your job to look for precursors. It's not my job as the writer to look for them. But anyway, I mentioned Disgrace, and I mentioned some sort of, you know, country house novels of the kind like Howard's End, where the house stands for something. But as you know better than I do, the South African tradition, and perhaps particularly the Afrikaans tradition, has even more explicitly a sort of farmhouse novel, does it not, as a sort of genre? And in some ways, maybe the Coetzee book that I should have been thinking of was not Disgrace, but an earlier one, In the Heart of the Country. I wondered if you had anything to say about just what it means to write this kind of novel as a white South African writer.
Yeah, I mean, the the farm novel is a sort of a staple of South African literature. I mean, or, maybe more so here than elsewhere. And I'd speculate that that has to do with the fact that we're an ex-colonial society, and the occupation of the land has a kind of a symbolic charge beyond the very obvious practical story that goes with it. So I'm not an academic, and I don't have a fully academic understanding of how the farm novel has developed and progressed, except through the reading I've done. It probably begins with a book like Olive Schreiner's Story of an African Farm, and the tradition, more or less, in its early colonial years, eclipsed or beautified, the process of subjugation that was going on, subjugation of the land and also of the people that occupied the land, into a kind of a vision of, Europe in another place. More recent writers, and you mentioned Coetzee, have subverted that tradition or attempted to do so. In the Heart of the Country was the first Coetzee I ever read, and it absolutely did my head in. I think because I just felt that he was blowing everything up, everything that had been sort of built in a very, stable and solid way was being inverted and kind of turned upside down. So I was very excited by it. I was not, again, consciously adding or trying to add to the, the dialogue or conversation around the farm novel, but I was aware that it would be seen as being part of that tradition. Right.
And can I just, this is really fascinating. Because I think this is something that must be, I wouldn't say uniquely difficult, but peculiarly difficult for South African writers in a way that perhaps it isn't for some of us. What does it mean when you're writing a book to be, to some extent, aware of how it will be read, that it will be seen in a particular way, linked to a tradition? Does that feel like a burden? Did you sometimes wish that? I mean, I'm just interested in that as a feeling while you're writing.
Well, is that so unique to South Africa? I'm aware that certain aspects of that very much are unique to South Africa, but I don't know enough about American literature, say, to know if there is something like a farm novel tradition there. But if there is, you would probably be aware in some sense that you were contributing to some, an established ongoing literary sequence of some sort. I mean, I think what you might be referring to, not that I want to put words in your mouth, is the fact that everything is so very highly charged here. So whatever decision you take, even a literary one, is contributing or taking away from books that resonate in far more than a literary sense. Which, what you said in your review in the New Yorker was absolutely apt. That a farm novel in South Africa can never just be a farm novel. The farm has to stand in for the nation in some way. And yes, I guess that is a burden. I mean, it's you feel the weight of speaking for more than what your narrative or your story might simply be saying. You're representing something larger. On the other hand, I have to say that because the language is going to be inadequate here, but because the issues one is tapping into in South Africa are still so immediate and so real and so consequential, the themes one is dealing with are likewise consequential.
Yeah.
So, in a certain sense, it's a literature in bondage, as Coetzee has said, but in another way, there's a gift that comes along with it, because this is not just writing that's abstraction and air. It's writing that matters. You know, what you're writing about is really important for human beings. So, you know, the weight of it is both, you know, a kind of ball and chain, and also a responsibility that's a kind of gift. I'm sorry, as I say, language is inadequate.
No,
but,
no, you could. I could absolutely tell that. As a, I mean,
answers you partially.
it really answers it because you can see what's beautiful about the form of the book is you can see you absolutely directly taking on that burden, right? It's as if you said, okay, yes, I know that the farmhouse is going to be seen as the nation, let's say the nation of white South Africa. I can't write about the land. I can't write about a black servant who has been dispossessed and promised something without bringing all that in. So I will absolutely take it and own it, and I will construct a form, wonderfully brief, let's say. I mean, this isn't a long book, but I will take a form in which, in 4 parts, I move between distinct phases, right, from sort of 1986 to 2018, of the development of modern South Africa. And I loved the elegance of that form. I mean, each section is what, 60, 70 pages, and fully inhabits that particular political moment. And I was thinking sort of jealously while I was reading it, how would that work in an English novel? How would that work in an American novel? There's no reason why it couldn't, but I think you're absolutely right that when you write as a South African writer, it's not only you've got that elegant form working for you, you've got the particular consequence, as you put it, heaviness of these themes as they've been playing out in the 80s and 90s. We have Mandela becoming president and Jacob Zuma in 2018 and so on. Yeah, it gives the book a lot of weight.
Yeah, I wonder if it doesn't, in a certain sense, sort of bring it back, you know, a little closer to, you know, the origins of writing, in the sense that, you know, where Greek drama first sort of played out, close to the beginnings of myth, if you like, where religion and storytelling, you know, came together. Not that religion is a you know, an essential part of this book, but I think you take my point. Sorry, my mouth is dry for some reason.
I do. I think part of the, I mean, I like to think that as you're writing it, you must have felt at some moment, as one does excitedly about form, when form has locked into place. I've got it. I've got the form, because something about those 4 sections, but also, as you say, this mythic structure of four deaths, 4 funerals, first the matriarch, then the patriarch, the whole question of Anton's promise sort of dribbling away, but in some way, this is a chronicle foretold. We know that we sort of pretty, just as we know he's never going to finish his novel, we sort of know that he has to end the novel has to end with his death. And yes, I felt again here, perhaps Faulkner comes into it, but the way you were able absolutely to write a contemporary novel that makes use of ancient structures, I think was wonderful. Let me just ask you about again the political thing. I presume, as a South African writer, when you're writing this kind of novel, there's going to be, I won't exactly say a decision because that sounds too conscious, but weighing on you, if you're writing a novel that begins in the 80s and ends in 2018, there is probably going to be the question of, how do I resolve this story? And does it resolve pessimistically or optimistically? And how open-ended can I be? And I wondered to what extent that was sort of weighing a little bit on you as you were writing. Particularly, I'm thinking of the last section where, you know, there's there seems to be a sort of fairly corrupt government going on, shortages of water and power, and things aren't exactly looking up.
Yeah, no, they aren't. When I began, my interest and focus primarily was with the family. I thought that, using this device of 4 funerals in an almost theatrical manner, like the 4 acts of a drama, would be an unusual way to tell the story of a family. The notion of telling any kind of story about the nation behind the family came after that, when I sort of, sat with the idea for a bit, and I realized that if you just widened the frame a little bit, that you could convey some of the background texture of what was going on in the country. And then I thought, well, if you space the funerals out sufficiently into different decades, there would be a different president in power, and that, the sort of national spirit that you'd be conjuring would be quite distinct and different in each act of the drama. Yeah. But even on the level just of the family and of individuals in the family getting older, the natural progression is downward, right? I mean, I'm not probably known for my optimistic outlook on life generally, and I'm probably drawn to themes that, express my view that, human life sort of waxes to the full and then declines. But I mean, that's hardly a contentious view. I wasn't trying with, well, I'm aware that there's a sort of a double decline. There's the, the individual decline of people getting older and moving closer towards death. And, the final terminus in that journey is death for all of us. But then there's the secondary story, which is of South Africa. Now, I'd have been very happy to tell a happier story about South Africa. And I wasn't trying to, labor the point of South Africa's decline, not at all. But in conjuring the kind of reigning spirit of each of the 4 last decades, right, it's undeniably true that the decline sort of mirrors, the bodily decline, that we're moving closer towards entropy and disintegration than rather than in the opposite direction. I wish I had a happier tale to tell, but the promise of the title is not only the immediate and obvious one of the promise of this piece of land that should have been given to the black lady who worked for the family, but it's also the promise of a nation that could have been so much better. Back in '94, we all believed it would be, I think, in an unreal and sort of, a kind of euphoric and deluded way. I think things are no longer euphoric, and then, less deluded too. I mean, one thing I can say about the current South African state of mind is that it's far more realistic than it used to be. But it's right. Not a great moment that we're in right now. No.
Right. Yeah. Animated wonderfully in your novel at the end, when perhaps I'm giving too much away, but when it seems as if the promise will be made good, and that Salome will get the house, but as her son sort of angrily says, you expect me to be grateful for this? It's too little, too late. And I think that was wonderfully done. While we're on the question of Salome, I suppose another fraught. Well, it's going to be fraught for all writers these days in an era of wariness around cultural appropriation, inhabiting other people's voices. But I presume, again, as a white South African writer, writing about an Afrikaans family with a black servant as it were, on the side, and I use that deliberately because she is on the side, despite Amor's desire to bring her to the center. But I presume as a novelist, there is a particular, South African novelist, there's a particular fraughtness around, and perhaps I sensed it in the novel of, okay, so I've got this narration which can move freely between characters. How freely do I inhabit Salome, the black servant, and how unfreely do I do it? Do I make it self-conscious? Do I just naturally use my novelistic gifts in the way that I would anywhere? But so it's always that sort of question of sort of allegory in a way that seems to press down, particularly on this form.
Yeah, it obviously was a question for me. Do I range as freely through the minds and inner lives of the black characters as I do, through those of the white characters? And I could, there's nothing really to stop my imagination ranging past those thresholds. But other things held me back. This might seem like a digression, but bear with me for a second. I sort of have this theory about the novel that it evolved as a kind of a diversion for the middle classes, and as such was probably intended to reflect, their own values back at them originally. Which is to say, I think, part of the project of novels, and it's one I have respect for, it's not essentially wrong, is to provide a certain sort of comfort to people, in the sense that novels open up a world and create some kind of rupture in that world, some kind of problem that needs to be solved. And usually the working out of the novel is the working out of a problem or a series of problems. And the ways in which novels resolve themselves, the kind of coherence that they need to have to really be satisfying, are also ways of reminding readers that the world can be set to rights, that, good people are rewarded, bad people are punished, and that ultimately the ruptures of the world will be healed. Yeah. Now that seems to me to be slightly meretricious, or maybe more than slightly, in that it doesn't resemble the world as I perceive it. It resembles some workings of the world, to be sure, but by and large, I think terrible dictators die peacefully in their sleep. Good people often lead absolutely unfulfilled or unrewarded lives, and so on. You cannot, I think, represent all the harshnesses and bleaknesses of an unbalanced world in literature and expect people to continue reading books, because there's very little, there's little literary pleasure in a project that doesn't resolve itself with the unities that Aristotle told us we needed. So I think people who've worked against the tradition of the novel with the intention of representing the way the world actually is, have tried to push against those rules of comfort, consolation, and resolution, if I can put it that way. And those are my instincts too. So with a character like Salome, and I'm sorry, I'm giving her South African pronunciation. I know Salome is the more usual one, but Salome is named, in fact, after a lady who looked after me in my infancy. So her name sort of matters to me. To go into her psyche, to render her inner life in the same way that I'm doing with the white characters, is in some way to imply that her place is on the same level as all the other characters, and that she is an integrated part of the world that I'm depicting, when in fact that is absolutely not true about South Africa. A character, a person in real life like Salome, who you will see every day on the streets outside, still has no voice and no presence in modern South African life, even 30 years or nearly 30 years into democracy. So that for me is a problem that needs to be represented or embodied in the book. So I took the decision not to go there.
Yes.
to circle around her being, as it were, but to create an awareness for the reader that this is a blank spot, that this is a question at the heart of the book that has not been answered,
Yes.
with the hopeful intention that it would make people uncomfortable and leave them with the sense of something that has not been worked out, has not been resolved. So it's interesting to me that the people who've been bothered by it in a literary sense, are mostly English critics. Nobody here has responded in that way. There's an almost instinctive comprehension that what's being represented is accurate, if I can put it that way. Because I think people instinctively know and understand that such a person occupies that space in just that way. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It does make sense. It was inescapable, it seemed to me, in reading the novel. I think there are a few lines in which you very briefly inhabit her consciousness as she's sitting outside, Salome's consciousness as she's sitting outside her house. But essentially, yes, the fact that she is a speaking silence in the book seemed absolutely considered and deliberate. Funnily enough, the thing it made me think of, which is in some ways absolutely appropriate, and in other ways a different kind of book, but there's a novel I really like called Loving by Henry Green that he published in 1945. That's a country house novel set in Ireland. It's an upstairs downstairs novel. Mostly it's written in dialogue, and it's mostly written in dialogue of the servants. The upper classes sort of make an appearance, but it's really a servant novel. And often he describes the servants at dinner. They're all transplanted English people. They're all Cockneys. They speak in broad Cockney dialect and jokes and so on that are wonderfully transcribed. And at the table, the only non-English person at the servants' table when they say have dinner downstairs is Paddy the Irishman, who's a driver. And Paddy is either completely mute, or whenever he speaks, no one can understand what he's saying. And that's what it actually made me think of. It's like, yes, that's right. That there's no false consolations will be offered. That's his position at the table in relation to the English servants. They're all servants, but some people are more servants than others, seem to be the implication. And I thought that was, I didn't worry about it. I simply had my attention drawn to it by the form of your novel. I don't want to run out all the time. That people may have questions. So I'm going to see if there are any questions. Lots of people said how much they enjoyed reading The Promise. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to type into the bottom. Someone here says their book group is discussing The Promise tomorrow evening, which is rather exciting.
There are some questions, James, in the Q&A box.
Oh, Q&A box. Sorry, I think I was looking at chat. So thank you very much. Sorry, I was looking in the wrong box. There we go. All right, Damon. Did you experience conflict with your editors and publisher over your style of writing?
No, in fact, not at all. I mean, I will say that having stumbled on this narrative voice, while it gave me a great sense of excitement to be, working with it and playing with it, it did generate a corresponding insecurity. I mean, I think if you do deviate from the established approaches, writing-wise, you're essentially going into terrain that's unfamiliar to you. So, you have to kind of learn the rules or make them up as you go along. I was not sure that what was exciting and thrilling me was going to excite or thrill anybody else. So I did feel deeply insecure through the writing of the book, and stopped at several points to ask sort of close friends if they would cast an eye over sequences of it and just tell me whether it was actually working for them or not. But then, no sooner is one reassured, then you start to think, well, that was a friend I showed it to. Maybe, maybe an editor's going to react differently. So, the real moment of truth only came when I could hand over the complete book to be read by a few select people. And it was, a huge relief to know that it spoke to them. But yeah, it was entirely possible in my own mind that an editor could have got this book and said, we can't do it like this. It just doesn't make sense. It's a mess, or whatever it may be. Right. In which case, I probably would have had to jettison it and think of something else, because the sort of multi-voiced mode of narration was just too much, grown into the book by then for me to think about it in any other way. Sorry, that's a very long answer to a simple question. No editors or publishers gave me a hard time on this score at all.
It's certainly wonderful to think of the leap from you worrying about the novel, thinking you might abandon it, anxiously asking friends to look at it, and triumph at the booker. This is a fairy tale that is yours, and that many would want to experience, although it may not have felt exactly like a fairy tale in the last few weeks as we've been doing endless publicity and the rest of it.
Well, fairy tales are often very dark and cruel stories, actually. So yeah.
Got another question about The Promise, but I also want to keep one open for a question. There's a question too about an earlier novel of yours, but we'll just continue with The Promise. Carolyn Kirby writes, I love The Promise, a fantastic performance on the audio book too, by the way. I don't know if it's you voicing that or not.
No, but no. It is a South African actor who's narrated it, yeah.
Right. I'm just curious, she writes, in this novel laden with symbolism, whether there was a deeper meaning to the lightning strike on Amor, if I'm pronouncing her name right, in her childhood.
No, not. I wouldn't say a deeper meaning. I wanted there to be something a little bit the matter with Amor, or to put it slightly differently, I wanted her to be set apart from the rest of the cast, and. I knew that something had happened to her a long time ago to make that true, and I decided on the lightning. It doesn't go any further than the notion that, as several members of Amor's family comment, that there's something the matter with her. There's something wrong with her, and I didn't want to make her too saintly or morally exemplary. So I like to leave that as a slightly open question for the reader. Is her moral resolve to see the promise through truly altruistic, or is it because there's something wrong with her and that she cannot let go of this particular dogged principle that she feels stuck to?
Yes. Genevieve Brassard asks, I'm a big E.M. Forster fan and really admired your book Arctic Summer. I'm curious about the process of writing such a novel, especially striking the right balance between researched and imagined material.
Yeah, I mean, that was a real diversion for me. I've never before, and probably never again will, write an historical novel. The attraction for me in that, or what drew me to that, aside from Forster's obvious connections to India, which I shared to some extent, was that I was obsessed at that time with what goes into the writing of a book, what diverse influences and events might inform, fill up the vessel of a book. And, you know, A Passage to India took Forster an inordinately long time. There were a lot of world events and a lot of personal events that went into the writing. So I was quite excited to cram all of those into the story. But yeah, beyond that, I'm not even especially drawn to Forster as a writer, although I love some of his books. But beyond that, I wasn't. I wasn't drawn to the notion of writing history or of writing Forster's history in particular. It was about the process of writing itself. Incidentally, James, you picked up in your review on a connection between Howard's End and the land issue or the farm novel in this book, which really interested me because it never consciously struck me. But I do think those unconscious connections carry over, book to book. So I sort of felt as if you'd put your finger on one there. It illuminated something for me that I hadn't quite understood myself.
Well, I thought of Howard's End, not obviously because of you've written your novel about Forster, but also because it has that optimistic ending at the end, as I remember, both from the novel and from the Merchant Ivory movie, of the sort of children in a fertile field of hay. The children and someone comes running in and says, the children are having such a time of it, and there's going to be a wonderful harvest. And that's your sort of classic allegorical novelistic ending, which is, there's abundance to come. It's going to be all right. And I guess that was a time, if we think of Lawrence Ends the Rainbow in 1915 with a rainbow, you ended with big symbols. And when I looked at your novel, one was struck by that absence, relatively speaking, and particularly the thing of Anton and Desiree not being able to have children, the low sperm count, and perhaps I was reading that too allegorically, but that's why I made that Forster connection. I did want to just ask you, there may be one more question to come, but I did want to ask you, and this may be too personal, but since you were talking about how this question of what goes into a novel, how a novel is written, and so on, was the writing, I mean, once you came back from the film experience and realized, oh, I can do something with the voice, did the writing get easier? Was the writing generally fairly quick with this book? And just, this is a silly question, but how many hours a day do you write fiction? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, no, it's not a silly question. I find a first draft and of almost anything, almost very close to unbearable. It feels to me like I'm mud wrestling with some invisible opponent in the dark, and I never feel I'm going to win. But that's just because you're trying to figure out everything from the names of characters to, the little turns of plot to, the bigger questions of what it is you're trying to say. Once it's mapped out, though, pleasure begins to enter the process. And the narrative voice, although I found it early on, took on its freest form in those last drafts, probably, the last overhaul, where I knew the answers to all of the smaller questions, and I was really reaching for the flow of it, because it was a narrative voice that gave you enormous flow. Even though it jumps, and the real difficulty, incidentally, in the writing of this book, is in the transitions. It's in those jumps. Usually transitions in time rather than in points of view. Those were the most challenging sorts of aspects. But I I start out, because it's so unpleasant, the beginning parts of a book, I sometimes squander days, scratching around 2 paragraphs. But I like to think I'm figuring things out at the back of my head, and that probably is true, because I do eventually get to the end of a murky first draft. But by the last stages, and certainly the last 8 months, 9 months of the writing of this book, I become so obsessed that it's very hard to stop. So I sort of have the opposite problem, that I put in over long hours and kind of tire myself. But I would say when I'm in a good flow and a good groove, I can write pretty much all day, sometimes into the night.
That makes me very envious. That sounds.
Yeah, but it's really not the norm. I promise you. It takes a good while to work up an obsession like that. It's certainly not the way I begin. And in a certain sense, I mean, it's not unrelated. You kind of have to write the book in order to find out why you're writing it. The last and biggest question that you answer for yourself is what drew you to this in the first place. And the finalization, the completion of the book is sort of where you really kind of put your hands on that answer. I think if you're going to really pull the book together, you have to in some way articulate that answer for yourself. So
yeah, I think it was Forster who has the line about how do I know what I'm going to say until I see what I've said, something like that. But that I know exactly what you mean. Like you've just got to have a certain amount down before you know what you're doing, where you're going, what questions you're answering. Absolutely. Speaking of questions, there's one final one, which is someone asking whether you have any particular background in poetry, because the narrative style of so much of this novel felt like reading a prose poem, asks the questioner.
No, I wrote sort of agonized, embarrassing adolescent poetry, and then I had another very brief spurt of poetry when I was living in a country house somewhere and imagining I was going to write a novel, and all I produced were a few constipated little goat pellets of poetry. But I do have a poetic impulse where prose is concerned. And that I don't mean by that, to write lyrical imagery necessarily. What I mean is that I think if you can find ways, the way I put this is probably not going to be very articulate, but if you can find ways in a narrative to make different levels of language pull in contrary directions, that you make the prose open up a little bit. So with an earlier book, like In a Strange Room, for me, that happened in the switching between the first person and the third person voice. It sort of opened up a third space, if you like, which was a kind of an echo chamber where, I'm going to get vague if I pursue that image, so let me leave it. But with this book, the narrative voice leaping from one point of view to another allowed me to make these switches between, say, a very cold, detached point of view and a much more intimate one, and various other, contrary kind of takes on what's otherwise, a single scene, to fracture the narrative, as it were, and see it from multiple points of view. That is, for me, serves the function of a kind of poetry where the language might yield up more than its literal meaning. And I'm sorry if that sounds vague, but it's probably as close as I can get to expressing what I mean.
It didn't sound vague at all. It sounded very concrete, actually. Well, thank you, Damon, very much for this. This has been tremendous. I think our hour is up, and our audience questions are exhausted too. But you and I could probably go on a long time. But thank you, and huge congratulations. I was so excited when you won the prize. I hoped and hoped, but we all know not to hope for these things. And for once, they got it right. So nice to see you, and thank you again.
Thank you, James. It's been a great conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, James, for doing this with us. And thanks, Damon. Congratulations on the Booker Prize. Well deserved. The promise is right here. I just put a link to the book on our website in the chat. So go ahead and click on that. You can get it from us. Here's one of James's books too, his latest. And also, I'm going to put a link to our YouTube channel in the chat. And this event will be going up sometime this weekend. If you have friends that you think should see this, you want to share it, feel free to click on that and share it when it comes up on our YouTube page. Once again, thanks everyone for tuning in. Thanks, Damon. Thanks, James. Hope to see you in person sometime. And everyone have a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.